Welcome to the CBER Lunchbox Podcast. Hello, I'm Jess Williams and welcome to the CBER Lunchbox Podcast. Today I am chatting to Joshua Powell, who is a PhD student at UCL and the Zoological Society of London. Hi Josh, and welcome to the CBER Lunchbox Podcast. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is actually the first time we're recording the podcast in person.
Oh wow.
So it's brilliant to be able to see you in person rather than having someone over a screen.
Oh no, it's very nice to be here.
So first of all, we're going to kick off with some quick fire questions. So number one, what is your favourite species?
Grey wolf.
Oh, can I ask a bit more and ask why?
I think as we'll get into later on, large carnivores are my thing. It's not tigers, which everyone assumes, based on that's what the PhD is about. I find grey wolves absolutely fascinating. Their relationship with humans over millennia. They also occur in some of the ecosystems that I'm most interested in as well.
I'm looking forward to hearing more about that later. Secondly, what is your favourite fieldwork location?
Yellowstone National Park. Closely related to the first one. We shot a film there in 2016 while I was doing my masters in the US, and it's an absolutely phenomenal location. So Yellowstone.
You're hitting a sore point there because my sister is currently out in Yellowstone National Park and I'm getting about 30 to 40 pictures a day, and it's one of the places I've always wanted to go, so I'm very jealous.
It's absolutely phenomenal, the wildlife landscape and the people as well. The scientists and particularly the wolf team are absolutely amazing.
Amazing. Okay, next question. Your ideal dinner guest, dead or alive?
I think Prince William would be a really interesting person to meet.
Interesting.
I had the opportunity to hear him speak at the London Conference on Illegal Wildlife Trade back in 2018. And it's a subject he's spoken about a lot. It's something I'm very interested in, and I think he'd be a fascinating person to talk to over dinner.
Well, he's still alive, so there's still a chance. Okay, so last quick fire question. Would you rather travel to the bottom of the ocean or the surface of Mars, and you'll be alive in both systems?
Very interesting. I think the surface of Mars, if it was Olympus Mons, I think that would be absolutely fascinating. I know a few people who've actually been down to the Mariana Trench, and they've,
wow.
I'm a little bit jealous of that. That's a very special thing to get to do. But yeah, they would both be very attractive.
But it's Mars for you?
I think so. As long as you could come back afterwards.
Yeah, we won't get into the time difference.
Yeah.
You can come back from both of them alive. Okay, now let's chat about how you got into science. So, how did you get into science? And did you always know you wanted to work in conservation biology?
Really good question. So I guess the science really came about because I was always interested in conservation biology, but not necessarily from the scientific angle. So I've always been interested in the environment and in wildlife for as long as I can remember. And I really wanted a career that made an impact in that area. And there are a couple of ways you could, a lot of ways you could do that, and there are a couple of ways that I felt I could do that. One of the options was the scientific route. It's not something that I necessarily want to stay in long term. It's not necessarily something that I want to spend my entire career in. But I ended up finding that it was a really good route to do conservation science work, which is the area of science that I'm really interested in. When I was setting out to go to university, I had a bit of a choice as a result. Would I go down the scientific route, or would I actually go towards environmental policy, because of course that's so important for the issues that I really care about. And I ended up going for geography, which is something of a halfway house between the two. It allowed me to do an element of both. And I'm actually based in the geography department at the moment at UCL for part of my PhD.
Cool. And have you got any family members working in STEM subjects or that have done a PhD?
No, so I'm actually the first member of my close family who's been to university. I have one relation who has been to university and got a PhD on study of the flute.
Oh wow!
He lives in America, and when I was out in the US, I got to see him quite a bit, which was really nice. But no, none of my close family members have even done a degree, let alone a PhD, and that was maybe a bit of an obstacle to doing the PhD. I didn't really have anyone to talk to about it, and I think that could be a huge benefit if you did have someone who had that experience before.
So how do you describe your PhD to family and friends? Do you have a elevator pitch?
Not really. It's evolved over the time because of the COVID pandemic, so it seems to change every time someone asks me this. But essentially it's about the transboundary conservation. So that's conservation across international borders, essentially, of large, threatened and traded carnivores in Northeast Asia. So the flagship species for the project is the Amur tiger. We might know them as Siberian tigers. But we've actually found doing the project that a lot of the techniques that you use, you can apply to other species, like Amur leopards, Asiatic black bears, even badgers.
Which we'll hear about in a bit. That sounds fascinating. The more I hear about different people's PhDs, the more I could wish I could do it. I don't wish I could do another one because it was hard, but there are so many fascinating topics out there. So, as you've just mentioned, your PhD is focused on these big carnivores, or, well, not so big in the case of badgers. And talking about badgers, I hear your latest work has been on the badger trade in South Korea. So, what has this got to do with the large predator conservation? And is there a high demand for badgers in South Korea?
Yeah, really good questions. In terms of demand, we don't know. There hasn't been any work that's been done on demand side of the trade. And really, as far as we're aware, this is the first kind of publication that's out there that's really looking into this in any sort of detail. It's very much a forgotten trade. Even Korean government officials often seem to be unaware that the trade is going on, despite the fact it's a legal trade. But one of the reasons that we're so interested in it, apart from the fact that no one's really done any work on it at all, and there hasn't been really any evaluation of the risks of this activity, is that illegal wildlife trade, and particularly wildlife farming, which is a specific subsect of that, impacts lots of carnivores around the world, and particularly in terms of the focus species for the PhD, the Amur tiger. So I think probably your listeners will be familiar with tiger farms, particularly in China, and a few famous examples in Southeast Asia, where it's believed there's probably about twice as many tigers on tiger farms worldwide as in the wild.
Gosh.
And this is something you also see in bears, particularly the Asiatic black bear. And I've been very lucky that I've got to help out an organisation working in South Korea on Asiatic black bear farms and looking to bring an end to that particular element of the trade, the kind of complicated legal situation there. But we came across some references to badger trade, and I was asking around with supervisors and colleagues in South Korea, and very few people had heard about this trade. So we decided to kind of delve in, find out a little bit more.
So what are they being traded for?
All sorts of different things, which is really interesting. There is a historical trade. It's things that you would expect, use of fur or pelts. Also they're used for traditional medicine, which surprises, I think, a lot of people. But since the trade was legalised and formalised, the farming component of it in 2001, and it was in a response to trying to shift away from bear trade. So the idea was that badger could form a substitute. But in that time period, and the 20 years since, there's been really a diversification of use of badger-derived products. So during the study, we recorded badgers being used in cosmetics, for example, so badger cream.
Gosh.
Which was really surprising. That's not something at all that we expected. Badger meats being used for human consumption. This is a very niche market. I think it's fair to say in terms of the number of outlets that are selling these products. But one of the important things about legal wildlife trade in particular, particularly when it's been poorly studied and poorly monitored, is getting an idea of what the trade's actually in. And that's what the study hopefully does.
And I'm really interested by this, so I'm going to ask a bit more. How did you go about finding out about the badger trade? Were you asking people on the ground? Were you asking people who are running these farms? And did you have was there any backlash towards asking those questions?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, consumer-based studies, but also speaking to farmers and traders are common techniques that are used in wildlife trade studies. But they tend to be when you've already got a good information base to start with. So a lot of the work that we were doing was putting together, there is actually some monitoring of the farms conducted by the South Korean government and a few other agricultural organisations. So we were trying to put together that data and understand where the badgers were being farmed. And this is the legal component. There may also obviously be an illegal component as well, like where the badgers were being farmed, what the kind of overall picture and trends were. And then essentially conducting an exercise online to gather as much information as possible on what they were being traded for, where the products were going, was there any international trade that was going on. And the hope is that more researchers are going to become interested in this topic and then going to begin to look at things like consumer demand and speaking to consumers. The reaction from farmers is interesting. Some have been very willing to, for example, share photographs, even those who are engaged in illegal activities, which is remarkable. Others have been much more resistant, and I think that they expect we might maybe be government representatives or representatives from NGOs, and that's very understandable. The trade has changed quite a lot, and it's condensed into a smaller number of individuals controlling the trade, with much larger farms than when it started out 20 years ago with these farms. So that in its own right may potentially lead to a bit of suspicion of outsiders as well in that context.
Understandable. And does it extend further than South Korea? Have you found that there's badger trade in other countries surrounding the country or further afield?
So the area of badger trade that people are probably familiar with is the trade in badger brushes, for which the major producer is China. But there is trade in China for some similar purposes. So we managed to find some evidence of cosmetics trade that involved badger in China, but also trade of wild and potentially also farmed badgers from China and wild badgers from Russia to South Korea. But it turns out that the trade in badgers, which are this incredibly diverse group, it's not necessarily a natural biological classification, but within common usage of species that we think of as badgers, has actually occurred for a very long period of time across a wide range of countries. In Europe, until fairly recently, badger oil was traded as a medicinal cure for things like backache. Badger meat is still traded in some countries today.
Wow, yeah, so much I didn't know. Okay, so going back to bigger predators, and Amur tigers in particular, what do you think is the biggest threat facing these amazing creatures?
Well, the one thing that we do know with tigers is that human-driven killing even, is the number one threat. And there are two components of that. The first is killing for what we've been talking about, for trade. The second component is conflict with human communities who are living alongside those big cats. And that's fluctuated over time, which of those two factors is the most important. But put together, humans are undoubtedly the number one threat to tigers in that regard.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, no, very sadly so.
And I mean, it already sounds like you found out a lot through your PhD, but what do you actually hope to accomplish through the research? Alongside becoming a doctor, which will be fantastic, is there anything you're particularly looking to accomplish with the research you're carrying out?
So, because the study system that we're interested in is fairly well known, I think it's fair to say, quite iconic species, we're looking to plug individual gaps where they identify. Some of those are geographical. So, for example, looking at the situation on the Korean Peninsula, which has typically been understudied for a lot of these species compared to neighbouring China and Russia. Others are more taxa-based. So the badger example is a great one of a couple of species that have been heavily overlooked historically. The project is actually, I think it's fair to say, maybe not as deep, but more broad than a lot of PhD projects often are, and that's really a result of the ongoing pandemic. And I think that's probably been the case for other PhD students. I don't think I'm unique in that regard. So each individual project feels like it's got its own objectives. And probably the first piece of work we did was looking at big cats around the Seoul area and the history of Amur leopards in Seoul itself. So this would be the only population that we're aware of urban Amur leopards at any point in time. This was in the late 19th century. And the aim of that piece of work was simply to raise awareness in South Korea of South Korea's history with big cats. Because this isn't something remarkably that's very well known, despite the fact the Amur leopard persisted in South Korea until 1970. And back in February, I was asked to go and speak at the National Assembly, the South Korean Parliament, about it. So it clearly had a measure of success, so that was good.
It's fantastic. So you mentioned the pandemic, which is probably one hurdle you've had to overcome, or many hurdles, during a PhD. But I was wondering, have there been any other hurdles that you've had to overcome? And if you could go back to the start of your PhD, what piece of advice would you give to yourself?
It feels like every 6 months brings a new hurdle. I hate to say that, but the whole project itself is very different to what originally I was going to be doing for my PhD. And the pandemic ended up being the final deciding factor in that one as to what was possible at this time. So I'd already had to change the project entirely. I mean, obviously, particularly for the Amur tiger, but also for the Amur leopard as well, the vast majority of both big cats ranges lie within Russia. And following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that's presented huge challenges, not just for my PhD, but for Amur tiger and Amur leopard conservation generally. So yeah, it has been immensely challenging in that regard, particularly because I went into the PhD wanting to do an entirely field-based project, and 2 years of lockdowns and restrictions, countries that had fairly strict COVID protocols, made that immensely difficult. I think if I was going back, I'd probably recommend actually that if I knew what I know now, sort of thing, maybe just wait and do the PhD later.
It would have been a good idea.
Benefit of hindsight.
If only. So talking about fieldwork, what has been your scariest or most challenging fieldwork experience to date?
It's always things to do with humans.
They're just the worst.
Yeah. I mean, there have been some great animal encounters that have been quite intimidating. A cassowary in northern Australia, I think, is the scariest animal encounter because it was completely unexpected. I was on a very narrow path. I kind of just got up and there was a cassowary on the path and trying to back away from what is a fairly large bird. I recommend any of your listeners to look up a picture of what these animals look like. It looks very prehistoric. But no, I think it's anything involving challenging human situations. Probably most of all was we were conducting some fieldwork in Georgia, where there are 2 Russian-backed enclaves, separatist regions following the 2008 war. And we came across an armed roadblock while off-road on the border of South Ossetia, which is one of those separatist regions. And that was very concerning because I was responsible for a team, and we also had film equipment and drones in the vehicle with us, which obviously we didn't want those individuals to get the wrong impression that we were there to spy on them or to film them. Yeah, that was by a long way the most scary.
Sounds it. Now to turn it back to a bit more lighthearted, have you had a funniest field experience you could share with us?
Okay. I find a lot of field experiences quite funny, and I think that's one of the great things about working in teams. You just build that great team camaraderie. A lot of it doesn't translate well into telling other people.
You had to be there moment.
Well, absolutely, precisely. I mean, a good example would be working in Azerbaijan, and a very, very close friend of mine was co-PI on the project, and we were working with wildlife rangers, and he was going to stay and interview some of the rangers back at base camp, and myself and the photographer and the filmmaker had the fun job of we got to go into the national park. I mean, this incredible landscape where there's Caucasian leopards, which is the kind of least well-known leopard population, I think it's fair to say. Just this absolutely stunning landscape down on the border between Azerbaijan and Iran. And he never really let us forget it, that we went off to go and try and find leopards and see this landscape, and we left him behind to do 3 hours of interviews.
Ouch. Okay, and finally, for fieldwork, what is the one object that you recommend people never forgetting when they head out into the field?
Multiple pairs of socks.
Multiple pairs of socks.
And your feet are so important, particularly if you're working in tropical environments. So really good quality socks, making sure to change them regularly, look after your feet.
Great tips, okay. Thank you. Okay, so now chatting about your work with Rangers Without Borders. Now this is a really interesting research study. Can you give us a brief overview, please?
Yeah, of course. So it's a very much a conservation-focused research study, and it looks at the work of wildlife rangers, but outside of the areas where we most typically think of their work. So Africa, and particularly the tropics, and possibly the US National Park System. And we wanted to find out a bit more about what some of the challenges facing rangers were in poorly studied environments around the world, or areas where there wasn't a lot of focus and there wasn't a lot of support, either at a government or international level for rangers. So we decided to focus on 3 areas: Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. And it really had a couple of aims. The first was to collect data and information about the challenges facing rangers around the threats that they faced and their anti-poaching capabilities, so a specific area of their capabilities to tackle those threats. But also their perceptions of transboundary conservation, and that's where the Without Borders bit comes in. Because, as we know, wildlife populations move across international borders all the time, and rangers, by their very nature, tend to be place-based. They're located for a specific protected area for a specific country. When animals cross international borders, the rangers can't follow them. So we wanted to get the rangers' perceptions on transboundary cooperation. It works very well in certain countries, and it's almost non-existent in others. So those were the 3 components we were looking at, but we also wanted to use it as an opportunity to promote the work of rangers in those countries, simply because we hear so little about the work of rangers there. And the project was funded by National Geographic.
Sounds like incredibly important work, and yeah, rangers are amazing. So what have you found the best thing about working with rangers from across your study areas?
I think the best was getting to see the perspective of other wildlife professionals working in these incredibly challenging environments, and their perceptions of the species around them. So a great example was we were conducting some surveys in protected areas along the border between Kyrgyzstan and China, an area where there'd been quite a lot of snow leopard poaching following the collapse of the Soviet Union and kind of the economic chaos that followed that. And it was amazing to speak to rangers who had been snow leopard poachers in the 1990s and were now rangers looking to protect these amazing big cats. And that was an incredible experience.
Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned National Geographic a minute ago, and I know you're a National Geographic Explorer, which sounds very cool. So can you tell us a bit more about that, what it entails and how you became one?
So it's just the name of the title that National Geographic give to recipients of their grants program. So anyone can apply. You can go onto the National Geographic website, and they have different categories of grants that you can apply for your project. They're looking for projects that have impact. They're looking for projects that are novel, unusual, and they're probably also looking for projects which are eye-catching, that people are going to want to find out more about. But yes, it was for Rangers Without Borders that I originally received that grant, and then you become part of the National Geographic Explorer community. But then there are other opportunities that come from that. So I still am involved with National Geographic. In February I did a talk for a school in South Korea that was organised by the National Geographic Hub that's in South Korea. But everyone has a very individual experience with National Geographic beyond getting that first grant. And the organisation gets different people involved in different ways, I think it's fair to say.
Sounds interesting. How do you juggle that side of things with doing your PhD?
So I originally got that for running a project before I started the PhD. So for me, it hasn't been too much of a conflict because the work that I've done since, so for example, the school talk, I themed it around work that I'm doing in my PhD now. Okay. And that worked really well because it's working in South Korea quite a lot, so I was able to talk about subjects that were relevant to where I was speaking.
And about the school talk, what age were the children and were they interested in what you had to say?
Yeah, so those students were secondary school. And yeah, they were very interested, which was good. It's always a worry when you're talking to school groups, and particularly secondary age, because we all know that that's a difficult time. I remember conservation school talks at my school that the students didn't respond well to. I think Chris Packham came to speak to the school, and the students didn't respond very well, unfortunately, which was a shame because I really wanted to hear what Chris had to say, and I'd love to have got to meet him afterwards. And it's a really difficult age to speak to. So yeah, fortunately they were interested, which is good.
That's good. So you've obviously travelled a lot. I mean, all the experience you've had, all the different places you've been to sound fascinating and amazing. But how do you feel about flying? How do you justify flying as a conservation biologist?
I really don't like it, first and foremost. When I was at school, I remember having to take a flight because I was going to an island, and I really didn't want to be on the plane because I knew what the impact of that was. So I think the first and foremost thing to say is that I really don't like it as a thing. It is undoubtedly if I look at my own personal carbon footprint, it is the area where I have the highest impact. I'm pretty certain about that without actually crunching the numbers. And so we all have a responsibility to tackle the areas that are our own personal area of greatest impact, and for me that's the travel side. So as a result, what I try and do is restrict it where possible. So this was something that I developed, and I did my master's in the US, which means I obviously had to fly out there to get there. But it's something I developed when I was in the US, that I was like, okay, I want to go and see places around the US, and parts of my degree will involve that, so I'll take the bus. The trains in the US are rubbish, so I just took the bus everywhere. I kind of would do an 18-hour bus ride I was in Philadelphia and I needed to go to Chicago, so okay, I'll get the bus. And it's a really interesting way to get to see places en route. You might not be able to avoid flying to the US, but at least you can avoid flying when you're there. A similar thing applies in Europe, whether that's I had to go and speak at the Vatican, so I took the train down to Rome, wanted to go on a holiday to Transylvania, so we took the bus as far as Budapest and then the train to Romania. And it's just an amazing way to get to see places. So yeah, that's my personal way to try and keep it down as much as possible. But for me, it is a big source where I'm always looking to, can I try and cut bits here and there? The other one, on a science perspective, linked to that, is that I really don't like the concept of international conferences. I think they're so outdated. I think they're so unnecessary. UCL and UCL Geography, interestingly, have been, I think, very good about looking at the impact of conferences and field trips and teaching overseas environmentally, and it's something that I very much want to do myself. Like, we can do these conferences, we can do these online scientific events online. We don't need to fly halfway around the world to do it.
If you do fly, do you offset your travel? And if you do you have any recommendations of certain places? Because a lot of these sites which say they will offset your...
Yeah, I don't for that reason. And the reason that I don't is that I actually don't think the numbers add up. So it's kind of some complicated maths to explain why this is the case. And I don't want to discourage people widely to do it because I think it is a good thing in some regards to do. Like there are, for example, Trees for Life and the Woodland Trust, I believe, both have carbon offsetting projects in the UK. The World Land Trust do in tropical forest areas. But a lot of commercial carbon offsetting you look at, essentially I believe you're ending up double and triple counting. So the amount that an individual is paying in is not offsetting that amount of carbon emissions, unfortunately. So I don't, and instead I try and channel it towards, or those funds instead towards conservation projects where it might not directly address the carbon side, but it might help in terms of conservation of species, which obviously is a twin interlinked issue.
It's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. So now moving on to guest lecturing. So I know you do a lot of talks, and you've mentioned a few that you've done so far, and within both education settings and wildlife tourism sectors. How did you get into this?
I don't know. I think I've always done it. I think the first time I did a proper talk was at school, and I was 14, I think, and I wanted my school to be more environmentally friendly and do a few things about it. So I had to get up and speak to a group of 17 and 18-year-olds about why they should care about the environment.
Oh gosh.
It was a really good experience. I can really recommend doing that if anyone listening is at school. But yeah, as a result, ever since I've done talks, on the education side, it's a hugely important element of the impact of our work is actually communicating that to public audiences.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. In terms of the tourism side, that's a little bit different. It actually came out largely as a result of necessity. So I needed to get to some fairly remote island locations, and so I needed to get a boat. And I managed to come to an agreement with some tour companies that they would take me to those locations. In exchange, I would give some talks to their travellers, and it worked out very well. And it's something I've done a couple of times since. But no, I quite like public speaking, and as I say, I think it's really important to do.
So you're obviously good at public speaking as well. And for people like me, so I get very nervous when I talk in public. I've got better. So, I mean, when I was at university, my kneecaps would shake when I would give a talk in public, which I didn't even know they could do until it happened. It's got better. I'm now done a lot of public speaking throughout my PhD, so it's getting there, but I still get quite nervous. Have you got any tips for me or anyone else listening?
It's very obviously healthy, but obviously if anyone's at school, I recommend practicing as soon as possible. Yeah, it's put yourself in challenging environments to do so, because once you've done a really challenging environment, if you can make it go well, everything else will be a breeze after that point in time. But no, just some general things is listen to something very motivating as public speaking beforehand.
Oh, okay.
We all have speeches that we think mean a lot to us, or people who we find inspiring when they speak. It can really help to listen to that beforehand. Another one is when you're looking at the audience, a lot of people I think are intimidated by there being a large amount of people watching you. Particularly if you're giving a talk to, say, a theatre or a lecture hall or something like that. So it can often help to pick a few points in the audience, and this could be individuals or just places even in the room, and move your eyes between them while you're talking. It kind of helps the audience show that you're engaged without you having to look at the whole mass of people that are in front of you, which can be, as I say, quite intimidating. And then as much as possible, try and move away from note cards. Like the fact of having note cards in front of you can, I think, almost make it even more intimidating, because then there's the temptation to read them. I mean, obviously that might not be possible if you're, for example, speaking a language that isn't your first language, in which case you're doing very well already.
Fantastic, thank you. And then final area to chat about is work-life balance. Without a doubt, you're very busy. But what do you do to relax outside of work, beyond your PhD?
I think I'm a bit of a workaholic. And it's not helped by the fact that like my interests are wildlife and animals, which everyone is so fascinated on. So yeah, I basically work on different conservation projects in my free time. I'm currently trying to convince local councils to put up small mammal warning signs to help animals like hedgehogs. So it's a very different spectrum, something much closer to home. I also really like medieval reenactment, so fighting with swords.
Please teach me, that would be so much fun. I'd love to do that.
It's really relaxing.
Relaxing, fighting with swords. How sharp are they?
They're blunt.
Okay. Bit safer though.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. I would never have guessed. Thank you so much, Josh, for coming on today. It's been fascinating to chat to you and hear the work that you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Jess. It's pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you.